of December 6, 1959, Dr. Harold Perelson arrived home after a long day of work. Harold was one of the most successful surgeons in the greater Los Angeles area and had even conducted speaking tours of various Ivy League universities. He was an exceptionally hard-working man, and this hard work had paid off in the form of an opulent Spanish colonial-style home in the neighborhood of Los Feliz. Harold's wife Lillian was hard at work decorating their home for the holidays, while their 3 children, 18-year-old Judy, 11-year-old Debbie, and 13-year-old Joseph, busied themselves with some homework before dinner. After a dinner so wholesome it could have been on the cover of a Christmas card, the children returned to their bedrooms to carry on their schoolwork, while Lillian retired to the master bedroom to read. Harold also opted for the comfort of a good book and poured himself a drink before settling down in front of the fireplace to thumb through his copy of Dante's Divine Comedy. There he remained for the next few hours, long after his wife and children had gone to sleep, yet instead of steadily progressing from chapter to chapter, Harold was focused on one particular passage of the Divine Comedy. It was a line from Canto 1, one which read, "Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, for the straightforward pathway had been lost." It's not exactly clear why the line resonated with Harold so much, but as he retired to bed, he couldn't seem to shake the passage from his mind. For the next few hours, Harold Perelson laid in bed, trapped somewhere between dreams and consciousness. Finally, after 5 in the morning, Harold quietly climbed out of bed, crept downstairs, then walked into the family kitchen. Careful to remain as quiet as possible, he retrieved a large, well-used ball-peen hammer from a toolbox that he kept under the sink, then walked back upstairs and back into his bedroom. There, he silently stood over his sleeping wife, hammer tight in his grip, possibly contemplating the enormity of his intentions for a few moments before finally deciding to strike. And when he did, Harold raised the hammer right into the air, then ended Lillian's life with a single blow. At least it's commonly believed that Lillian died instantly because she certainly didn't make enough noise to wake up her 3 sleeping children. Even so, to ensure that she was dead, Harold began to smash his wife's skull to pieces, inflicting blow after devastating blow with the flat steel of his hammer. After murdering his wife, Harold crept into his eldest daughter's room, intending to execute her in the exact same manner. Yet although she appeared to be asleep, Judy had been awakened by the sound of her father opening the door and was watching him from the corner of one eye as he quietly approached her bedside and raised the hammer. As Harold attempted to execute her, Judy was able to raise an arm, deflecting the initial blow and potentially saving her life. Then as her father attempted to finish her off, she began to scream so loud that it not only roused her siblings from their slumber, but it also woke the neighbors on both sides of the Perelson's house. To silence her, Harold struck his eldest daughter several times about the head and face, but it was too late. He could already hear the sound of his youngest daughter emerging from her bedroom, seeking the source of the disturbance. Harold intercepted 11-year-old Debbie before she could enter her sister's room, then guided her back to bed under the pretense that she simply had a nightmare. He'd assumed that he'd beaten Judy unconscious and that he'd be able to simply creep back in and finish her off once he dealt with young Debbie. However, reassuring his younger daughter had taken much longer than he had initially anticipated, and after walking back into Judy's room, Harold found it completely empty. Judy had escaped out of an open window, carefully sliding down a section of roof before jumping to the hard concrete below. Despite a nasty sprain, adrenaline propelled Judy to the door of a horrified neighbor who was quick to respond after having already heard her screams. This neighbor then alerted emergency services, and before long, the streets of Los Feliz were awash with the red and blue lights of ambulances and police cruisers. 11-year-old Debbie had not been fooled by her father's explanations, and while he stormed about the house trying to locate her older sister, Debbie had gathered up her brother before the pair of them fled the property. Having realized his home was quickly being surrounded by police and that his children had all managed to escape, Harold prepared to defend himself with deadly force. As the teams of EMTs rushed the Perelson children to a nearby hospital, the cops closed in on their home and forced their way inside. They carefully advanced from room to room, calling out to Harold, terrified he was waiting to ambush them from some unseen vantage point. Yet after gaining access to the family bedroom, the police officers found Harold lying on the floor of his ensuite bathroom, having ingested a fatal dose of prescription drugs. The crime scene alone told a grisly story of inexplicable and violent madness, yet the most important question remained unanswered. Why in the world had Harold done something so utterly horrifying? During the initial phase of the investigation, the police questioned the Perelson neighbors, but were told that the family were close-knit, loving, and showed no visible signs of discord. However, following a search of Judy's car, they found a letter which read, "We are on the merry-go-round again. Same problems, same worries, only tenfold. My parents are in a bind financially." The letter also mentioned how Judy intended to find a part-time job in order to help contribute to the family finances. Investigators began to theorize that Harold had simply snapped under the pressure of their dire financial situation and had decided that taking his loved ones' lives was preferable to the misery of poverty and uncertainty. Yet the fact remained that Harold neglected to leave any kind of note, and with Judy stating that her father made no attempt to explain his actions, his motivations were likely to remain a chilling mystery. The only clue Harold ever gave was leaving his copy of the Divine Comedy open, with that same line highlighted. "Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, for the straightforward pathway had been lost." Once they were well enough, the three Perelson children were reunited, then sent out east to live with relatives. They have since dropped off the radar, and it's commonly believed they've changed their names to avoid any association with their father's crimes. Many years later, once the media firestorm had died down, the Perelsons' Los Feliz mansion was sold off at auction, with the proceeds going to settle the estate's debts and the remainder going to the children. Initially, the auctioneers were extremely skeptical that the home would sell, as they were legally obliged to inform potential buyers of the home's history. Yet to their surprise, one couple seemed very interested in purchasing the home. Julian and Emily Enriquez didn't seem in the least bit disturbed by the mansion's dark past, and their single, solitary bid secured the Perelson home at an extremely reasonable price. Yet instead of making the mansion their permanent residence, the new owners only visited the home on rare occasions. Neighbors said Julian and Emily would show up in the dead of night before carrying large trunks or pieces of furniture inside. They would never sleep there and appeared to use it for nothing but storage, but some in the neighborhood began to theorize that the couple's nightly activities were much more sinister. After all, why would they be so interested in purchasing a home so many believed to be haunted? When Julian and Emily Enriquez passed away in 1994, ownership of the mansion passed to their son, Rudy. Neighbors had long since grown sick of how the mansion's rotting carcass dragged down nearby property values and hoped that Rudy would quickly renovate and sell the place. Yet after a few months, it appeared that Rudy Enriquez was doing exactly the same thing as his parents, showing up in the dead of night, then dragging a variety of unusual-looking items up the driveway and into the house. Rudy also appeared to have enlisted the aid of a variety of unsavory-looking people, although what exactly he needed their help with remained a mystery. One neighbor claimed that, after questioning a group of shady-looking visitors to the home, the group claimed that they were ghost hunters and camped in the mansion's backyard for several days while they conducted a series of paranormal surveys. The presence of the ghost hunters briefly reignited the media firestorm surrounding the Perelson murders, and Rudy Enriquez was forced to publicly deny that he believed the house was haunted, yet he certainly seemed okay with granting access to those that did, which in turn was judged as being in very poor taste. To keep the old mansion rotting and abandoned was one thing, but to use it to profit from a horrifying murder was beyond the pale. The move forced Rudy to admit the opposite was true and that it was him paying for ghost hunters' services, although frustratingly he refused to elaborate further. The presence of ghost hunters and the subsequent media interest seemed to solidify the home's reputation as being haunted by the spirits of Harold and Lillian Perelson. It became known as the Los Feliz Murder Mansion, a tourist attraction for the more macabre-minded visitors to LA. Many famous paranormal investigators have also visited the murder mansion, with some boasting of discoveries and evidence, either real or imagined, often in the form of hearing voices and whispers while roaming the outside of the house. One such investigator told the press that he'd felt the presence of extreme energy inside the home, and that a number of so-called orbs had been photographed in the mansion's upstairs bedrooms. To the skeptics among us, the presence of so-called orbs is explained by a heavy amount of dust or other such debris in the air. Naturally, being such an old, derelict home, the Los Feliz mansion would have been a veritable dust trap, but there's just one problem with this explanation. In order for orbs to appear, dust needs to be thick in the air, and the only two things that can stir it up in such a way is strong exterior winds causing drafts, or the physical presence of something inside the house. The paranormal investigators have claimed that they photographed the exterior of the house before they ever entered, and that orbs appeared in these photographs, meaning that either strong winds had stirred up dust in the home that day, or that someone, or something, had been moving around in the house shortly before their arrival. Whether you believe in such phenomenon or not, the reports certainly make for chilling listening, but it still seems redundant considering the abject horror of the original crime. Dr. Perelson's reasons for wanting to murder his wife and children remain a complete and utter mystery. It's easy to blame the family's financial problems, but such a self-destructive behavior seems completely out of character for a man who so dearly cherished his hard-won success. As cryptic as it may be, I believe the best clue to Harold's mindset lies in his choice of literature during his final few hours. Dante's Divine Comedy tells the story of a single dead soul which travels through hell and purgatory before eventually reaching heaven. The soul witnesses God's divine rewards for just souls, but they also witness the horrific punishments meted out to the hordes of mortal sinners who find themselves condemned to hell. Some have suggested that Dr. Perelson was seeking reassurance for his actions, reasoning if it was a sin to murder them, if the goal was to save them from a life of misery. But there are others who purport that the passage from Canto 1, the one which seemed to hold Harold captive, was in reference to his own sanity. Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, for the straightforward path had been lost. Harold hadn't lost his way in life. What he mourned that night was the loss of his mind. On the evening of December 12, 1996, 21-year-old Justin Greavette of Ontario, Canada, handed his father a package. 42-year-old Wayne Greavette had worked at a beverage packing plant in the small town of Guelph for most of his life. He and his wife Diane had been high school sweethearts and had gotten married when they were just 17. Wayne hadn't been expecting anything in the mail, but given that the holiday season is sometimes one of pleasant surprises, he didn't think anything of opening it to see what was inside. After opening the small cardboard box, Wayne discovered a handwritten letter, along with a brand new flashlight. Wayne then took the flashlight out of an unaffiliated piece of wooden packaging, walked over to join his family on the living room sofa, then attempted to switch it on. In an instant, Wayne and his family were showered in white-hot sparks as shrapnel ripped through flesh and upholstery alike. Wayne received the bulk of the injuries, and although he was stunned and terrified by the blast, young Justin rushed to call 911. The recording of this call is freely available online, but is extremely distressing to listen to. When asked what the nature of his emergency was, all Justin could do was wail that there was a bomb, and my dad just blew up. First responders rushed to the Greavette residence to administer vital first aid, but sadly, it was far too late. Wayne had been killed almost instantly by the small but violent detonation. Forensic investigators observed that the package was wrapped in white and green wrapping paper. Inside was a box labeled Domaine D, or Cabernet, which used to hold a bottle of red wine. At the top of the box, a rectangular hole had been cut neatly off. Investigators suspected that this was to remove the barcode in UPC, which could be used to trace the wine to where it was purchased. Apart from the flashlight and the letter, several flyers were used to pack the wine box. Most of these flyers were widely circulated in southern Ontario. However, one stood out, a flyer advertising Copeland Lumber, a building center located at 700 Main Street, East Milton, which suggested the mailer might be local to the area. 2 strands of hairs were recovered from the debris, but since neither had their roots attached, it was impossible to generate a DNA profile. Ontario Provincial Police soon enlisted the help of the FBI to generate a more complex mitochondrial DNA profile, but the process failed to generate any solid leads. The flashlight used to house the bomb was a Duracell brand floating lantern, around 23 centimeters long and 15 centimeters tall. According to Justin, the flashlight might have been glued shut, as he was unable to open the flashlight when trying to get it to work. A small amount of explosive emulsion called superfrac was used in the bomb, a material more commonly associated with mineral mining. Superfrac can be easily bought from the manufacturer without a license, but investigators stated that it was more than likely to have been obtained via theft. The bomb was also packed with roofing nails to maximize its destructive effect, and was powered by a single-cell AA battery. The package's enclosed letter was a business proposal written by a William J. French. In it, the letter's author states that he and a partner were planning on starting a new venture known as Acton Home Products in early 1997, and that he would like a quote from Greavette on some potential equipment repairs. The author also mentions that he and Greavette had worked together in the past and writes with a generally friendly tone. The letter mentions 2 names, that of Lisa and Joe. Lisa is commonly believed to be Lisa Irvin, while Joe was a man by the name of Giuseppe Zodich. Both had worked with Wayne at the beverage packing plant that he was employed at, with Lisa working as a secretary, while Giuseppe was employed as a delivery driver. Although once thought to be significant, their names are mentioned in a purely innocuous manner, referencing only their employment at the packing plant. Despite addressing Wayne as if they had once done business, no one in the Greavette family knew who William J. French was. Much of the information in the letter had been completely made up and was believed to be designed to lull Wayne into a false sense of security, so that he'd operate the torch and secure his own demise. One thing, however, was chillingly and abundantly clear. Whoever had written the letter was well aware of what would occur when Wayne switched on the torch. As the postscript of the letter read, "Didn't realize you had moved. Had some trouble finding you. Have a very Merry Christmas, and may you never have to buy another flashlight." When it came to suspects, police were able to generate one particularly promising lead with alarming speed. After questioning the staff at the nearby Acton post office, police discovered that not one, but 2 different people had inquired as to the Graivette's new address in November of 1996. Local law enforcement was able to produce a series of composite sketches based on eyewitness statements, but unfortunately, the sketches failed to generate any promising leads. Another person of interest in the investigation was a man named Ed Gallick. Ed was Wayne's boss down at the packing plant and trusted him so much that he would place Wayne in charge whenever he was on vacation. Ed was also very close with Wayne's family and was known as Uncle Ed among the Greavette children. Yet such a close relationship belies a rocky past. Wayne's wife, Diane, had also been employed at the packing plant, at least up until Ed demanded that Wayne personally fire her for poor performance. On top of that, Ed had once accused Wayne of skimming cash from the business, and had even alleged that Wayne used narcotics while on the clock. The contention eventually led to Ed's dismissal from the packing plant, yet he remained vocal in his assertions that Wayne was a thieving drug addict. He and Ed went from the best of friends to vicious enemies, and although Ed had never been formally linked to his old friend's murder, it's been suspected that Ed's estranged son may have intervened to avenge his father's perceived injustice. The fact that Wayne's financial situation was going from strength to strength may have also angered Ed. At the time of his death, Wayne and Diane were preparing to establish a spring water bottling facility on a piece of land they'd purchased known as Mofat Farm. Wayne was mechanically gifted, and he took care of the facility's machinery while Diane worked on the logistics. Once the plant opened, the venture could have potentially made the Graivettes multimillionaires, so it's no coincidence that someone sought to snuff him out before he got it off the ground. It seems impossible that such a crime could ever go unsolved, especially considering the sheer amount of physical and circumstantial evidence. Yet more than 25 years later, police are no closer to identifying Wayne's murderer than they were back in 1996. Whoever hated him so much that they construct an elaborate explosive device is probably still walking free, having taken the life of a loving family man and completely gotten away with it. Just less than a week after Christmas Day, in the year 1800, the residents of the fledgling New York City made a shocking and grisly discovery. The body of 22-year-old Elma Sands was found at the bottom of a well, having been brutally beaten and strangled before being tossed into her watery grave. Local magistrates believe that she was still alive at the time when she was thrown down the well, and that she survived the fall before bleeding to death in its sodden bottom. But the question was, who could have committed such a shocking crime, especially at such a festive time of year? Elma was last seen alive on December 22nd of 1799, after telling her cousin that she planned to run away with her one true love, a carpenter by the name of Levi Weeks. Elma and Levi lived together in a boarding house owned by a man named Elias Ring, who told police that although the couple were deeply in love, they had a habit of getting into vicious arguments with one another, especially whenever alcohol was involved. Not only that, but neighbors reported that Eli had started acting very strangely around the time of Elma's disappearance. With Levi's name being the only one on the police's list of suspects, he was promptly arrested and charged with his lover's murder, and the build-up to his trial was a grim circus of public outrage. Following the discovery of Elma's body, Elias Ring used a loophole in the law to gain possession of her corpse. He then exhibited the body in his boarding house, incidentally in Elma's former lodgings, and charged the local citizenry a few cents each to view it. Ring himself was responsible for inciting visitors, regaling the public with inflated tales of Levi Weeks' cruelty and short temper. Local authorities allowed such a travesty, having no doubt that Levi was the guilty party, and the vast majority of the local denizens wished to see Levi hung. The prospect of a fair trial was so poor that future Vice President Aaron Burr felt compelled to publish an article in a local newspaper urging the public to keep their heads until the crime could properly be investigated. Burr would later aid Weeks even further by volunteering his services as an attorney, but was the accused's only high-profile support. Levi Weeks just so happened to be the brother of Ezra Weeks, one of the United States' most renowned and sought-after architects. This enabled Levi to be represented by the country's most successful lawyers at the time, including the aforementioned Aaron Burr, along with none other than Alexander Hamilton. It is rumored that both men owed Ezra Weeks sizable sums of money, and they took the case as a way of paying him back. Aaron Burr also happened to own the well in which Elma Sands was found, making him even more intimately connected to the case than initially believed. Levi Weeks' trial began on March 31st of 1800, with all of New York hanging on every word. The prosecution's first move was to bring in a number of doctors to testify the death could not have been her taking her own life. This was easily countered, however, as none of these physicians had actually been present during Elma's autopsy, and only surveyed her body during Elias Ring's grim boarding house exhibit while it was in an advanced state of decomposition. Even worse, one of the doctors was proven to actually be a dentist and had lied to magistrates in the hopes of financial betterment. The defense argued that not only was Ezra Weeks completely innocent of the crime, but they had actually identified the case's single strongest suspect, a man by the name of Richard Croucher. Croucher also happened to be a president of Elias Ring's boarding house, just a few doors down from Elma and Levi's place. Initially, Croucher was brought in by the prosecution as a witness, and he did a fine job of stoking the jurors' opinions against Weeks with the tales of his frequent bouts of drunken rage. Yet the defense was able to trick Croucher into making a number of extremely damaging admissions. The most damaging of these was when Alexander Hamilton was able to coax Croucher into admitting that he'd had a number of confrontations with Elma in the weeks before her death. They also used several of the prosecution's own witnesses to attest that Croucher had been instrumental in aggressively spreading rumors about Levi Weeks following Elma's disappearance. One witness stated that Croucher had been wandering into various stores and taverns, yelling about how Levi Weeks had killed his lover after uncovering evidence of her infidelity. After extensive questioning, it became apparent that Croucher himself was the source of almost all the rumors implicating Levi and Elma's death. But without a doubt, the trial peaked when Levi's superstar defense team was able to get one particular witness to testify that none other than Richard Croucher himself had been spotted near the Manhattan Well around the time that Elma was thought to have been murdered. In stark contrast to modern court proceedings, Levi's murder trial lasted little over 48 hours, and the jury pronounced him not guilty after just 5 minutes of deliberation. Hamilton and Burr had been so successful in their efforts to defend Levi Weeks' name that a public who'd once despised him actually whooped and hollered when he was cleared of all charges. Yet despite walking out of the courthouse as a free man, Weeks' reputation was in tatters, and he ended up moving down to Mississippi, where he started a large family and ultimately passed away at the age of 43. In spite of plans to put him on trial for Elma's murder, Richard Croucher was able to escape justice. He sought asylum with the much-hated British, who allowed him passage to England and a chance to a new life. Yet it's not difficult to conclude that Croucher was a murderer, as his ultimate fate gives us a damned good idea of his involvement in Elma Sands' death. Richard met his end on a hangman's gallows after he was convicted of strangling a young woman to death. A courtroom heard how Croucher had attacked the woman late at night, and after strangling the life from her, he picked a chillingly familiar place to hide her body. He threw her down a well. Somehow, word of Croucher's execution reached New York City, and those familiar with the case toasted to delayed justice. But it was a cold comfort to Levi Weeks. Croucher's death couldn't bring back Elma, and from then on, the holiday always seemed just a little less jolly. On February 9th of 1972, Jonelle Matthews was born at the Cottage Hospital in Santa Barbara, California, to 13-year-old Terry Vieira. Since Terry was incapable of taking care of her daughter, Jonelle was quickly adopted by Jim and Gloria Matthews, a married couple living in Greeley, Colorado. The Matthews were able to provide a good life for Jonelle, as Jim earned a generous salary working as the principal of Platte Valley Elementary School in Kersey, Colorado, and for a long time it seemed as though Jonelle had escaped a life of uncertainty for the safety and love of her adopted parents. But sadly, just before Christmas of 1984, tragedy would visit the Matthews family in a way that sparked national mourning and deep-running outrage. On the evening of December 20th, 1984, 12-year-old Jonelle was performing in a holiday concert at Intra-West Bank of Denver as a member of Greeley's Franklin Middle School choir. Neither of her adopted parents were present, as her father was attending his biological daughter's basketball game, while her mother had traveled out of state to visit her chronically ill father. At around 8:15 p.m., Jonelle arrived home after catching a ride with a friend named Deanne Ross. Then, shortly after 8:30, Jonelle answered a phone call and took a message from her father. It's not clear who the caller was, but what is clear is that this marked the last time anyone spoke to young Jonelle Matthews. Jim Matthews arrived home at around 9:30 p.m. to find the family's garage door open, but instead of finding Jonelle present, as he expected, Jim found the house empty. Jonelle's shoes and coat were in their usual place, near a heater in the family room, but she was nowhere to be seen. Deeply concerned for his adopted daughter's well-being, Jim Matthews contacted the local police, and following their arrival just a short time later, they found a number of footprints in the snow outside the Matthews home, indicating that someone had been watching Jonelle through the house's windows. There were no signs of a struggle or a forced entry, and with snow on the ground, Jim believed it was unlikely that she could have gotten far without shoes. However, after a preliminary search of the area, it was clear that Jonelle had gone far further than mere foot travel would allow. For several weeks after her disappearance, law enforcement placed Jonelle's birth mother, Terry Vieira Martinez, under surveillance, all without telling her that Jonelle was missing. She was considered to be the single most probable suspect in her daughter's disappearance, yet the surveillance turned up nothing in the way of usable leads. Jonelle's disappearance ended up attracting a great deal of interest from the public, including many high-profile celebrities and politicians. President Ronald Reagan mentioned Jonelle Matthews during a speech in March of 1985, and she was also mentioned in the House of Representatives' congressional record in the month that followed. Yet sadly, despite the case receiving national attention, there was no progression until many, many years later when a team of construction workers made a horrifying discovery. On Tuesday, July 23rd of 2019, excavators installing a pipeline about 15 miles southeast of Jonelle's home unearthed a child's corpse. A forensic expert listed the cause of death as gunshot wound to the head, while a DNA analysis confirmed what many had already suspected, that the body belonged to the missing 12-year-old, Jonelle Matthews. Just a few months later, Greeley Police Department announced that 69-year-old Stephen Dana Pankey, a former Greeley resident who twice ran for Idaho governor, was a person of interest in Jonelle Matthews' murder. Pankey and his former wife lived about 3 miles from the Matthews home, and he had been a youth pastor at the church the Matthews family attended. Police in Twin Falls, Idaho then extensively searched Pankey's condo after he refused to talk to detectives from Colorado, and in October of 2020, he was officially indicted on charges of kidnapping and first-degree murder in Jonelle's death. He was held without bail at the Ada County Jail in Boise until he was extradited to Colorado. Pankey had previously told journalists that he didn't know Jonelle or the Matthews family and had only heard about them following the disappearance. He also claimed that he and his wife were home on the night of Jonelle's disappearance, and that they were planning to leave town the next day for a Christmas visit with family members in Big Bear Lake, California. Decades later, Pankey provided investigators with documents concerning this trip, which police said contained false statements and superfluous details. After interviewing Pankey's ex-wife, Angela Hicks, police discovered that they had started their trip on December 22nd, 2 days after Jonelle's disappearance. She also said this trip was unexpected and that her husband had seemed bizarrely desperate to get out of Colorado for a while. Angela Hicks also mentioned that following the couple's return to Greeley on December 26th, her husband seemed to take an unusual interest in the disappearance. Her exact statement mentioned that, and on the ride back, Pankey had been uncharacteristically glued to the radio, searching for news of the girl's disappearance. Pankey then began digging up the couple's garden, before a car on their property suddenly caught fire and had to be disposed of at a salvage yard. Yet more evidence mounted when it was discovered that, in the few months following Jonelle's disappearance, Pankey had attended a church service where a minister claimed that Jonelle would be found safe. His ex-wife claimed to have heard Pankey muttering a response accusing the minister of being a false prophet. Years later, in 2008, Pankey's son was tragically murdered, and at his son's funeral, Angela Hicks reportedly heard Pankey say, "I hope God didn't allow this to happen because of Jonelle Matthews." Suddenly, when it was clear that the case would be brought to trial, Pankey repeatedly claimed to have knowledge of the crime and asked for immunity in exchange for information. Pankey also ended up giving an interview in which he claimed he was being framed by the police because of his sexuality, identifying himself as a celibate homosexual. His claims proved hollow, as on October 13th of 2020, Stephen Pankey was finally indicted on charges of murdering and kidnapping Jonelle Matthews. He was found guilty of the kidnapping and murder of Jonelle by a Weld County jury on October 31st of 2022, and received a sentence of 20 years to life in prison. His earliest possible release date is in 2042, at which point he will be 91 years old. But why release a man who spent so many years getting away with the murder of an innocent young child? Stephen Pankey stalked, cornered, kidnapped, then killed Jonelle, and seemed happy to basically taunt the police with stories of his apparent involvement. There's no doubt in my mind that the man gained a perverse amount of pleasure in deception, as well as in the recollection of his crimes. So to allow him to die in freedom is the ultimate insult to Jonelle's memory. click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. Laci Rocha was born on May 4th of 1975 and raised on her family's dairy farm in the small town of Escalon, California. She spent much of her childhood working on the family farm and particularly enjoyed gardening with her mother. Sadly, Laci's parents divorced when she was still very young, and she ended up living with her mother in Modesto, while her father was granted weekend custody. She was an athletic teenager and earned a place on the cheerleading teams in both middle school and high school before going on to study ornamental horticulture at California Polytechnic State University. As a student, Laci would often hang out at a place called Pacific Cafe, where one of her friends worked, and it's there that she met a man named Scott Peterson during the late spring of 1994. After swapping phone numbers, Scott and Laci began talking and going out on dates together, which their first being a deep-sea fishing trip on which Laci became violently seasick. Despite the literally rocky start, the couple's relationship got increasingly serious, and before long, they began to share aspirations of marriage and children. After he and Laci moved in together, Scott shelved his professional golf ambitions to focus on more attainable and reliable enjoyment, while Laci worked part-time in order to contribute to the couple's finances. All seemed well with the couple, and it seemed like only a matter of time before church bells rang. Yet in tandem with cultivating a wholesome monogamous existence, Scott Peterson was indulging in a number of secretive, extramarital affairs. With his infidelities concealed, Scott and Laci got married in Avila Valley on August 9th of 1997, and the following year, the couple opened a sports bar called The Shack in San Luis Obispo. Business started slow, but the couple's persistence paid off, and eventually they were able to sell the business for a tidy sum before returning to Modesto as very wealthy people. To maintain their finances, Laci would take a job as a part-time substitute teacher, while Scott found a well-paying job at a newly founded branch of a European fertilizer company. Neighbors believed them to be a perfectly happy couple, and Laci in particular was said to possess a very sunny disposition. She openly celebrated her first pregnancy in 2002 and was quick to announce that they would be welcoming a baby boy named Connor, who was due in February of 2003. Yet sometime in November 2002, when Laci was 7 months pregnant, Scott met a Fresno-based massage therapist named Amber Frey, and the pair began conducting yet another extramarital affair. Then, less than a month after the affair commenced, a heavily pregnant Laci seemed to vanish into thin air. To celebrate the Christmas holidays, she and Scott had spent a weekend together in Carmel, California, yet Laci didn't appear to have returned with Scott when the vacation had concluded. The last people to talk to Laci before she vanished were her sister Amy and her mother Sharon, who later constructed a timeline of events for police investigators, and this timeline is as follows. In the early evening of December 23, 2002, Laci and Scott drove over to Amy's salon where Scott got a haircut. During his time at the salon, Scott really seemed to want people to know that he was playing golf that day because, according to official reports, he told multiple people that he would be doing so that day, emphasizing it on a number of separate occasions. Sharon spoke to her daughter at around 8:30 p.m. that evening, unaware of the fact that it was the last time that she would ever speak to her. Scott then claimed that the last time he saw Laci was in the morning of Christmas Eve, and that he hadn't thought anything of her absence when he returned. The only unusual thing he noticed was that their dog was missing, but after safely locating the errant hound, he decided to take a shower before simply waiting for his wife to return home. It was only around 5 p.m. that evening that Scott reported his wife missing, but when the police arrived at his home to question him, they found that he was unusually calm for a man whose pregnant wife had just disappeared. Following a quick search, police officers found Laci's purse and car keys hanging up in the closet, a deeply worrying sign. But even more disturbing was the fact that, on the kitchen table, a phone book was open to a page with a full-page ad for a defense lawyer. This could have been nothing but a coincidence, but it's fair to assume that the officers found such a detail to be deeply unsettling. In the days that followed, hundreds of volunteer search and rescue teams worked tirelessly to help find Laci. Modesto police and firefighters focused their search around the area of Dry Creek, the place where the Peterson's dog was found. A $25,000 reward was offered, one that eventually ballooned to a quarter and then $500,000. But sadly, not even a sizable reward, a poster campaign, and a candlelight vigil were able to generate any solid leads. It later emerged that while on the way to his missing wife's vigil, Scott called Amber Frey to spin an elaborate lie as to why he wouldn't be able to see her in the near future. According to him, he was on his way to France and was planning on spending New Year's Eve in Paris with a few close friends. Scott even went as far as giving her a fake European phone number, one he had engineered to reroute the call to his current cell phone number. Amber later said that Scott had told her something to the effect of, "In my mind, we could be wonderful together for the rest of our lives." And he called again the following day with empty affections such as, "I wish you were here." Yet unbeknownst to Scott, Amber had been closely following Laci's disappearance and was furious after realizing the extent of his deceptions. So, partly out of duty and partly out of revenge, Amber had contacted local law enforcement before agreeing to cooperate in their investigation. A short time afterward, Amber taped a phone call with Scott in which she confronted him regarding his wife's disappearance. According to her, he tried to explain his actions by explaining that there are different kinds of loss, but he soon gave himself away by claiming that Laci was alive and still living in Modesto. Laci's parents and siblings had long since suspected Scott's involvement in their daughter's disappearance, but had prayed that their suspicion was misplaced. Such suspicions seemed based around the fact that Scott seemed alarmingly calm considering his situation, with one of Laci's cousins telling the media, quote, "I saw more reaction out of him when he burned the god-darn chicken." Now, with concrete evidence of Scott's dishonesty recorded on tape, more and more people began to realize that all was not well beneath the surface of the Petersons' marriage. Scott realized that in order to throw off the eye of suspicion, he would need to embark on an extensive public relations campaign. In early 2003, he organized a televised sit-down interview with TV host Diane Sawyer, and spent the majority of it talking about how great his marriage was and how he was innocent of any involvement in Laci's disappearance. He was only partially successful in turning around public opinion, and news of the interview was overshadowed shortly afterwards by a frighteningly grisly discovery. On April 13th of 2003, a pair of dog walkers were trudging through a marshy area of San Francisco Bay, just north of Berkeley, when their dogs began to bark at something lying in the bushes. On closer inspection, the dog walkers recoiled in horror. What they had discovered was the surprisingly well-preserved body of a late-term male fetus, one with an attached umbilical cord that appeared to have been torn, not cut or clamped, as normal procedure would dictate. Naturally, the dog walkers reported their discovery to the local police, who in turn came to a frightening realization. The area the fetus had been found was the exact same place Scott claimed to have been fishing the day of Laci's disappearance. Less than 24 hours later, another member of the public was walking through the same area when they stumbled across the dead body of a recently pregnant woman. She was found washed up on the rocky shoreline of the bay, roughly a mile or so from where the fetus was found, and was wearing beige pants and a maternity bra. The body was decomposed to the point of being nearly unrecognizable, and the poor woman had been haphazardly dismembered before being dumped. A few days later, DNA analysis confirmed the body belonged to none other than Laci Peterson and her unborn son, Connor. The discovery led to Scott Peterson's arrest on April 18th of 2003. At the time of his arrest, he claimed he was on his way to play golf, but his car was packed with luggage and his naturally dark brown hair had been dyed blonde. Police also found $15,000 cash and rolls of mixed bills, tons of camping and survival gear, 4 cell phones, and 2 driver's licenses in 2 different names. Scott claimed that there was an innocent explanation for the contents of his vehicle, but he was clearly planning to go on the run, and if it wasn't for the swift intervention of California police officers, there's a chance that he might never have faced justice. 3 days after his arrest, Scott Peterson was officially charged with 2 counts of murder with premeditation. His trial began in June the following year, and after many months of stomach-churning testimony, Scott was convicted of first-degree murder for killing Laci and second-degree murder for taking the life of his unborn child. He was said to have laughed at the verdicts that were read aloud before the court and promised to appeal to the conviction as soon as he was able. Judge Alfred DeLucci then handed him the death sentence and remarked that Laci's murder was one of the most cruel, uncaring, heartless, and callous that he'd ever heard of. However, Scott managed to avoid execution, as in March of 2019, the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, issued a moratorium for all 737 prisoners on the state's death row. This basically postpones all executions until the current governor's term is concluded, meaning Scott will most likely end up dying in a prison hospital and not by lethal injection. Laci and Connor Peterson's death led to the creation of a new law known as the Unborn Victims of Violence Act, also known as Laci and Connor's Law. This act ensures that under federal law, any person who causes death or injury to an unborn child while in the commission of a crime upon a pregnant woman will be charged with a separate offense and thus have their sentence dramatically increased. Years later, in October of 2005, old coals were raked over when Scott tried to claim on Laci's $250,000 life insurance policy. Such a brazen move drew the ire of many a critic, and the attempt was soon quashed by a superior court judge. Instead, the money was awarded to Laci's mother, Sharon Rocha, who authored a book entitled For Laci, A Mother's Story of Love, Loss, and Justice. The book became a #1 seller on the New York Times nonfiction bestseller list in 2006, and is perhaps one of the most comprehensive explorations of a mother's grief. Scott has never fully admitted to killing his wife, thus keeping his motives a mystery. Perhaps the best clue is the fact that he repeatedly referred to baby Connor as Laci's child and not his own. This could be to absolve himself of the pain of having murdered his own unborn son, but it could also have been concrete fact. Perhaps Laci had mirrored her husband's infidelities and admitted that Connor was not Scott's child. The revelation could have driven Scott into a murderous rage, and rather than face the humiliation of being hoisted by his own petard, he chose murder. But no matter how bad their marriage was behind closed doors, there's no way to excuse Scott's horrific course of action. He was already having multiple affairs, and there was no reason why he couldn't just walk away from the marriage, and that's what makes it clear that it was an issue of control. If Scott couldn't control Laci, then she didn't deserve to live, and that kind of logic makes people like Scott very, very dangerous. Traci Mertens met her future partner, Joey Kavanaugh, when the pair were just 16 years old. It was the definition of puppy love, and after many happy years together, they had 2 children, a boy and a girl named Kelly and Daniel. The family was happy at first, but by the time the children were in diapers, deep cracks had started to appear in Traci and Joey's relationship. They began to bicker and argue, and when it emerged that Joey was a functioning heroin addict who owed a great deal of money to some very bad people, their marriage was all but over. But for the sake of the children, they decided to stay together on the condition that Joey sought help for his addiction. By Christmas time of 1994, Traci, Joey, and their 2 children had moved to a new house in Rochdale, Greater Manchester, partly because it was more affordable, and partly because the move away from their native Birmingham broke Joey's addiction network. On Thursday, December 22nd of 1994, Traci traveled back to her old home in the Neshells neighborhood of Birmingham. She planned to return to Rochdale that same day, but ended up staying overnight at her sister-in-law's place. The next day, she returned to the Cattell's Grove house at around 11:50 a.m. and had been in the house for no longer than 10 to 15 minutes when there was a loud knock at the front door. When Traci answered the door, 2 masked men grabbed, blindfolded, and forced her into the back seat of a yellow Ford Escort. She was then driven out to a secluded churchyard, doused with petrol, and set on fire. The 2 men then left her to burn to death. Yet in an awe-inspiring display of resilience, Traci managed to crawl around 30 meters towards a main road, where she was found by a passerby who rushed to call emergency services. Traci's burns were nothing short of catastrophic, She suffered third-degree burns over more than 95% of her body, with the wound so thick that doctors had difficulty finding a blood vessel to start a drip, but she was still alive. Over the next 24 hours or so, Traci fought against the pain to provide a full and detailed account of her ordeal. She described her attackers as being tall, Afro-Caribbean, and between the ages of 20 to 30 years old. She also noted that although the men spoke English with a Brummie accent, meaning that they were native to Birmingham, they also communicated in a foreign language that police later suspected to be Jamaican patois. Traci stated that after forcing their way into her home, the men demanded to know where Joey was. Then after telling them that he was all the way up in Manchester, they bundled her into a yellow Ford Escort that had a stuffed animal attached to the rear right window. Traci's loved ones drew hope from her initial prognosis, but sadly, in the early hours of Christmas Eve, Traci suddenly passed away from her injuries at the age of just 31 years old. When detectives searched the Cattell's Grove property that Traci was abducted from, they found the word death daubed on one of the windows in red paint. Police also received an anonymous tip from someone heavily indebted to drug dealers, who was told that if he didn't settle his debt, he'd get what Traci Mertens got. Homicide detectives spoke to thousands of people as part of their investigation, but were never able to properly identify the suspects. When interviewed by police, Joey claimed that he had no idea why Traci was burned alive, but claimed it was impossible that it was related to his drug addiction, as he had settled most of his debts before moving up to Manchester. In November of 1997, an inquest into Traci's death determined that there was insufficient evidence to explain why she'd been murdered. The case is still open, and the Cheshire police are offering a £30,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Traci's killers. It's been almost 30 years since Traci Mertens was burned alive in that churchyard, and her death remains a horrifying mystery. We can only hope that she and her family can find some measure of peace after so much suffering. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, I'm an angel in an earth suit.